Good morning. COVID-19 has resulted in stay-at-home orders across the country, which has affected all of our lives. And even now, as states continue and cities are reopening, I think that today, more than ever, stay-at-home orders are continuing, which is very difficult for families. I know that children are home being taught by parents, and sometimes that feeling of pressure can overwhelm us, especially when it becomes isolation and we have economic uncertainty. However, I know as hard as it is for the stay-at-home orders, which can be catastrophic at times, especially for individuals whose lives are plagued by domestic violence. October, as many of you know, is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. To show my support for domestic violence awareness, I wore my purple ribbon today. But I also want to talk a little bit about the Department of Justice really big focus right now on Project Guardian Domestic Violence Initiative. I want to focus today on what ATF can do better, what we can do better to identify situations of domestic violence in our investigations, but also how we respond to dangerous situations and how we, more than ever before, can really help victims of domestic violence. So today, I'm happy to say and proud to be sitting next to Carol Adams from the Richmond, Virginia Police Department. Thank you for being here today. I'm very honored that you took the time out to come and talk to me today, because Carol has an amazing story. I think her story of what led her to public service and what really led you to become a police officer. I would love to hear a little bit about your journey and your story and your personal challenge that made you decide to come on and say, hey, I want to be part of helping women or helping victims of domestic violence. I think that it's a noble, definitely a noble path that you took. So I'd love for you to just share a little bit about that with me.
Wow, good morning, and thank you for having me here. Well, I always knew that I wanted to help people. As a little girl, I just loved helping people. And so our household, it appeared from the outside to be just this normal, everyday family, a mom, a dad, and two little children. But behind those doors was where, things really got tough. I can remember from the early ages of elementary school where the violence started, and it basically started with verbal abuse between my dad and my mom. And over the years, it escalated to physical violence. And my dad drank a lot, so I considered him to be an alcoholic, but Monday through Fridays they went to work, but there were days when they would come home and it would be this silence between them. Mm-hmm. And later on in the nights, we would be awakened to fighting in the next room. And we would run to a locked door, and where I could hear my mom screaming for help on the other side. And he would always say, go back to bed, everything's okay. And so we would have to wait until the next morning to see that our mom was okay. And this continued all the way up until my high school days. And as a kid, I had always gotten into the middle of the fighting if I was present, because I wouldn't allow him to fight her. So I had a plan to leave my home and my family and to never ever return again once I graduated from high school. And it was December 30th, 1980. I was a senior in high school and I would graduate in June. And we all went off to work that morning because it was during the Christmas holiday. And when we returned home, something was different. My mom was preparing to go out with friends, and she wasn't allowed to go out. So that automatically struck me as an oddity. And so when I looked at him, he usually would be fussing and raising a lot of Cain and stuff to make her feel as if she wouldn't go, which was, his routine. And but he wasn't this particular day, and so my attention was just directed on him. It's like, so what's going on? Because this is just out of the ordinary. So Mom went out to be with her friends, and I went down the street to be with a couple of my friends, and it's about 11 o'clock when I came home. And I remember walking up the stairs. We lived in a duplex house, and as I entered my room, The house was quiet. I didn't hear any talking from anybody, not even the TV. And as I sat down on my bed and that I shared the room with my sister, and I reached down to take off my shoes, in the next room, I heard pow, 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 pow. So those gunshots rang out in their room, which we shared just with the wall. I ran to the phone and I dialed 911, and I told them that my dad had shot my mom. And I could tell them that because he had threatened her so many times in his drunken outrages that he was going to kill her in front of us. And as I talked to the dispatcher and she asked me all of these crazy questions, you know, and as a 17-year-old, I'm saying, just send me help, lady. You know, I don't want to answer your questions. Just send me help. And so he did not leave. He stayed there on site. The police arrived, and my mom had been shot 5 times. There was no urgency to take her away. The police talked with him, and eventually the ambulance took her to the hospital. And we went to the hospital, my sister and my family, and it was hours before, you know, they came out to tell us that she did not make it.
Just captivated by your story. And I would imagine every time you share, it evokes triggers again back to that time. And I hope that as you sometimes share, that there's a healing that comes when you share as well. So thank you for sharing that. I would imagine that after that time, there was a new role for you and your family as well. I know that the calls that we answer to are difficult to have all the right answers. You know, what do we say, or how do we respond to these types of calls? And I know that I often hear, which kind of makes me wonder why people ask this question, but they say, well, why didn't that person leave? Or how come they didn't leave sooner? And there's so much more behind all that. And I believe you know, right? So share, you know, if we could help educate when someone asks that question, well, why didn't that person leave? You know, the response is a visceral response for me, right? So maybe if you can help educate some of us out there, especially, you know, why that is, you know, what's underneath all of that.
Okay. Well, life after that, life away. When you think about a person living under the control and authority of someone else. So they are being fed psychologically that you can't make it without me, you know. So those are some of the things that when you talk about a person dominating someone's psychic, so they don't want them to have outside contact. So the only information they're being fed is these less than comments, but a damage, which, you know, is about a damaged self-worth. They don't understand that the value that they have. And then out of fear, we know that when someone decides that they're going to leave, their life is 5 times more at risk to lose that life, because that perpetrator does not want to lose that control. And then a lot of people think that they could change the other person, because moms want dads to be present with their children. They want to have a family just like everyone else. And they just want to give that person a chance, and they think and believe that they can change that individual. And then for their children, they want their families to be just like what the American picture looks like, you know, that everybody's happy and happy-go-lucky and peaceful. And then like with our family, you know, it's like, and when you look at people that were born in the 50s and 60s, is that you do not break up your family, you know, so it's the family expectations, and the cycle is probably occurring in their families, and you just do not leave your household. You stick there, you stay there, and you stick with it, no matter how bad it is. And then financially, how do you make it? You know, how do you pick your children up and you go and start all over again, and you don't have the financial means? And it's not just being able to make it, but you have those little people that you have to still talk to every day. And if they had everything, all the luxuries of home, and you talk about going to a shelter or going to stay with family members, and now they don't have those things, so you have double pressure, the pressures of trying to survive, but then you still want to make sure that your children are comfortable too. And then isolation, where are you going to go? Your family will let you come stay for a little bit, but if you don't have the means to move into your own place, then, and more than often than not, you just go right back home and you just manage it. And that's what most victims do. They just manage it because at least they have the other 90% of the time, they have the comforts of a loving home.
And I would imagine that all of that, circulates in your mind, in your psyche, and in your everyday life, that you start to believe that this is the only, what's the alternative? I'll just stick it out. And I think, for you at that time, I would imagine that kind of, stayed with you to say, I'd like to choose a life of public service to maybe help or educate. Is that the impetus?
Yes, absolutely. And to help families like mine and children like me, because the children they're hostages. They can't leave. They just can't pick up and go.
Yeah. I see that, when I hear your story, I imagine being in that same situation and what would motivate and inspire you to want to, educate the young and children and respond to these types of calls. So that leads me to one of the questions. You have become a law enforcement officer with, I call it your storyline. And your storyline you bring to the table every day. You bring to your work every day, which is your history, your experience, and everything which helps you to do your job. If you could say, what do you feel is a law enforcement officer's important for us to be aware of when we do encounter domestic violence situations like that? If you can give advice, or that one thing when we're executing warrants, or when people are in possession of firearms that are known to be involved with domestic violence. What would you give us some advice on how do we make that better?
Well, first of all, consider the entire family, not just the target. Most of the time in policing, we're just focused on the target, to go in and to remove that target. But we have to also consider the impact of the removal and everybody that's going to be involved, because if there are children there on site, first of all, they're going to be impacted because you're taking the target away, and the target is dad or mom, whichever one it may be. So you have to think about how to make that as delicate as possible, but to be able to, fulfill your goal. And to also not just do the removal, but to go back and have a conversation and to help everybody that's left behind understand. And that means that you're building a relationship with them. And those little children, and I can tell you, in the late 70s and 80s, the police never talked to us. That even the day of, even with the homicide, I could not tell you the name of the homicide detective that worked my mother's case. And that's how much communication that person had with us. And so just be mindful that you may not remember those children or the people that you encounter, other than the person that you arrested, because you will have a case file, but those individuals will always remember you.
So I'm hearing having a little bit more compassion for the children, especially if we encounter, we go to execute warrants, or we do anything that has to do with going into the home or family, let's say even to retrieve a firearm, that we would be able to humanize it a little bit more, right? To actually have a conversation and speak to them, to give them a sense of comfort that, like I said, not knowing even the process or who the homicide detective was, speaks to maybe not having that connection. So that makes sense. I appreciate, some of the guidance for us when we go out and do that kind of work. I always say, we treat the people that we investigate as people too, and have human kindness regardless of their history or their background. So
and the same thing, same kind of care for the family that's left behind.
Thank you. I have a couple more questions. I'm kind of interested. Our agents that work in the field, we encourage them to reach out to our victim witness assistance program, because we have a very robust program that helps to support domestic violence victims. Yes. And anytime that we encounter someone we believe needs help or assistance, we contact our victim witness assistance program coordinator around the country. We have them all around the country. What are some of the ways that our agents can help ensure that some of the safety of the victims? That we get that question often is, do we call, where do we bring them? Or if we encounter them, what do we do with some of the victims, and what could we do better?
Knowledge is power. And so in any and every opportunity that they can is to take more training about domestic violence so they can create an awareness for them, but also to partner with local agencies that provide services. And you're a victim witness program assistance specialist, being there with them, because the agents will learn alongside, your specialists. And it's really, really important is that to humanize the victim. That is really, really, really important. And to just have a conversation, because they may already have a plan in place. Because sometimes as police, law enforcement, we go in with our own plan.
Right.
And because that person has been living through this, they may have a plan and just need some assistance fulfilling it or taking the first steps. So that's really, really important for them, and to reassure them also. But to educate themselves as much as they possibly can, and to work with the local the local partners, so that they can have a lot more understanding. Because as I was driving up today, we place a lot of emphasis on homicide, traffic investigations, traffic fatalities, and we know all of the resources for those type of incidents, but it's the same thing with domestic violence. And we need to place more emphasis on the learning as to the who, the what, the where, the why, and who can help us, especially when we're going in, and to help feel them safe. Because if your agents had a list of service providers along with your victim witness, and if your persons are not, the victim witness is not specialist, is not there yet, at least that officer would have be able to communicate and have some conversation with the persons before their arrival.
Makes I'm having ideas floating through my head of how to make it better when we do. I look at it as a holistic team approach, right?
Yes.
Where we respond, but yet if we encounter a victim who's in need, we should probably be more prepared with who to call, and maybe incorporate that as part of our operational plan, if we think that that's going to be the case. So I appreciate the answer to that. I have just a couple more questions.
It's okay.
So under the Domestic Violence Initiative, the Department of Justice, we're really focusing on efforts to investigate and prosecute people who illegally possess firearms after being convicted of a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence. We call those G9 cases. But we have protection orders against them, and I think that sometimes those are difficult cases for us sometimes to prove and work through. So are there other ways that ATF agents and personnel can become involved in the fight against domestic violence overall?
Yes, they can go to the schools, spend some time with the kids, and like I answered before, additional trainings, but also like with what you're doing here, you're having this conversation, this information is being shared with all of your agents. But I mean, those are the key things, and you host events also to create awareness, and that's the key. Education is a priority, and we have to continue that. And even after arresting the perpetrator, you could check back with the victims later on. In Richmond, we would do knock and talks on Sundays to go and to make arrests, but then I would go back, send my officers back to just leave a card to check on mom, to check on the kids, to say, hey, we haven't forgotten you here. Yeah. So anything, it's the little things that really, really make a difference. And so it's just a matter of if a person is gone to jail for a long time, check on that individual that's left behind, because sometimes moms struggle, being a single parent. And then also, if your agents are allowed, I go into the prison system myself, and I speak to individuals who have committed murder, who have murdered their significant others because of my family history. So at any opportunity that presents itself, or even to create it, to say, okay, we want to be on the forefront about educating against domestic violence and creating this awareness and this is being proactive for your agency.
Right. And we pride ourselves on no better partners, so we do partner with police departments to help facilitate even going into jails and working with even perpetrators, even to ask them questions and interview them on where they obtain the firearm, what was the behind it, the impetus. So according to statistics, law enforcement officers are sometimes injured or killed responding to domestic violence calls. Why do you think domestic violence seems to be one of the most dangerous calls for law enforcement? I think it's, I don't want to say self-explanatory for a law enforcement officer, but behind it, what do you think is really why it's the most dangerous?
So it does carry the reputation for being extremely dangerous. So the perpetrator's response, that's what makes it the most volatile, because if that person it could be a hostile demeanor, and he's waiting because he knows the police has been called and he does not want to go to jail, and which he could result in even assaulting the officer once the officer gets there into the space, but also shootouts from long distance, or laying in the bushes to ambush, and that is because that person's mental ability to think straight and to work through things, he's just lost it all. And then when you think about that freedom, and he's lost control, because when we look at the dynamics of domestic violence, it's power and control. And if he's programmed her, I'm going to hurt you if you call the police, and then she calls the police. So that retaliation is taken out on those first responders. And so first responders have to be aware that, you don't pull right up to the front door, you don't pull up into the driveway, because you just do not know where this person is. And then at other times, the victim could turn against law enforcement. So you have to really be on your P's and Q's, because once you get there, the person that called you may well resort to assaulting or hurting you. So officers have to approach with delicacy each and every time. As soon as they get the call, the planning should start as to how we're going to approach this, and if there's any historical context that they can pull up, like we do on our screen, so that we can see how many times that we've responded to this call. And then also, even if dispatch can help them with, is there a registered firearm? Sometimes they do have registration, and sometimes they're not. So it's just this big unknown. So that's what makes it so volatile, because of the mental capacity. And like with my dad, when he had a gun and he drank, that was it. We saw that gun, and when he said he was going to kill her, and he kept his promise. And sometimes, when the person is calling, they will let the dispatcher know that, hey, this is what he says he's going to do, and this is a plan. So please pay attention to the call and pay attention to the historical outline of the interactions with this person, and if they have prior assaults against police officers, because they just have lost all respect for authority, and that they by any means necessary. And then some have the intent of suicide by cop, because they know that there is no way out, and this is it, and their freedom's going to be taken away. So it's a reverse psychology, because when you go on calls, sometimes the perpetrator will make him or herself the victim. Right. It's like, she did this, I'm the innocent one. And then they do the exact same thing, because that means they take the responsibility from themselves. And then when they make law enforcement take their lives, then it's not the perpetrator killed the spouse, but law enforcement killed the perpetrator.
There's a lot there.
Yes.
Listening to you, what I'm hearing is there's such an escalation and obviously an evolution of how it started from incident after incident after incident to that peak, and I call it when that person's in the red zone, hot zone, and how do you even rationalize or have a conversation? But something that you said jumped out at me about how the victim can turn against law enforcement, because that's the mental abuse that she's had, and there's a protection happens. So you got a lot going on. Then you have suicide, and all sorts of reasons why this is probably one of the most dangerous calls for law enforcement out there, because I would say there's a lot of meat to everything that you're saying, and that's why I ask these questions: is how do we get that message out, even when we respond with our officers, that person attempted to purchase a firearm. Is there ways that we can make things better there? So that leads me to another question about restraining orders. Restraining orders will become very important when ATF investigates, for us, illegal possession of a firearm by someone who has certain orders of protection issued against them. So I know that filing these restraining orders are sometimes very difficult for the victim.
Yes.
Right? Are they effective? Those are things we need to help the next piece of our investigation, to use that as hey, this person had a restraining order against them and they still attempted to purchase a firearm. So give me your thoughts on the restraining order, effective for victims of domestic violence, and how would a victim go about getting a restraining order?
Okay. Well, first of all, it's just a document.
Yeah.
Right. It's just a piece of paper that's shared between the two and filed in the court. So, and I can say they're effective in some cases and then less in others. And that still goes back to the mental health of the perpetrator.
Yeah.
And, it's only going to prove a positive if the perpetrator's desire to accept whatever the conditions are outlined. And if that person says no, they're not going to accept it, then it's not going to work. And that's the unfortunate part. But for public safety and for law enforcement, it helps us in the case because the victim has this document on file. But if that person is deemed that they don't really care what the victim does, that they're going to make their way to them, then that's what they do. And that happens a lot.
For us, we need to make sure that they still file those restraining orders for us, right? Because that helps us to be able to say, hey, we can charge that person because they had a restraining order against them when that firearm came into play. So, it's a hard one to swallow sometimes, I would imagine.
Yeah, but it's important that when we're working with victims to help them understand the need for that document and that could help further their case. And so that helps us, and that once it's violated, then that gives us more opportunity to be able to remove that person from violating their world.
So with all the psychological and economic stress, are you seeing more, like right now, especially with COVID and pandemic and stay-at-home orders, this feeling of being, isolated, right? Are you seeing more first-time abusers?
Well, it's difficult to gauge that. In our department, our agency, and I was working on another report, so I went back to find the numbers. From January to July, we've had a total of 13,759 domestic calls. And when we looked at our calls for service for the year, domestic violence was next to the highest numbers. So, but we don't have the technology to see which were first times.
Oh, I see.
But we got to remember that the hotline statistics reveal that, it takes a victim about 7 instances before they make the call. Period.
Okay.
So it's hard to tell.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I'm paying attention more to it as well in our own organization of calls that we get, or are we seeing an increase in more issues of our agents or even our workers having more contact with police because of they had a domestic at their home and they responded. So I'm tracking that. That's why I asked. It's hard to get the first timers, but it's more of an awareness that I think with COVID and our environment changing and becoming not so able to kind of socialize or be out in public, or maybe the kids at home, how all that escalation of economic stress, if you've lost your job, I just can't even imagine. So I've been talking about it quite a bit, at least every few weeks on my town hall calls about, being mindful of that. So that's why I think the question to me was more of a curiosity too.
Yes.
So I'm going to shift a little bit. I know you have obviously a passion, for law enforcement, because you bring your heart to it. You bring your experience. I call it your storyline to work every day. I know you've received a lot of awards for your work, and I think purely because when someone loves what they do or has that sense of purpose and meaning, it's reflected in their work. So what do you feel has been your greatest personal accomplishments?
Well, my first one was to raise my 3 children in a violence-free home.
Oh, nice.
And to break that cycle and to keep it from repeating itself within my family. And second is the creation of the Carol Adams Foundation, a 501(c) nonprofit.
So great.
Was created in 2014 in honor of my mother, Oreen Adams. And it was to be able to provide gap services for families, because as an officer, I would respond to calls for service, and I would always end up taking care of the family myself, because there was just, the services were gaps. There was so many gaps. And once I started to work with someone, and even if I went to a service provider and they couldn't help me, I still had to help. So I've been doing that for about 20 years. And so then we created the organization, and that's, and then 2 years ago, we opened up our resource center, and this is a safe space for anyone, but specifically children.
Oh, nice.
And I wanted to help children just like me that were like trapped in this cocoon of violence, and being raised and born in the 60s and 70s, what happens in the house stays in the house. So I think some of that still goes on. So children just don't have a safe space that are experiencing this violence. And so I wanted to show them through my life experience, but to have a space that they could come and they could be themselves, and the sky's the limit, whatever you want to be, whatever you want to do. And so I love that when we provide emergency shelter, transitional housing, transportation, youth programs, adult and youth peer support programs, and parenting classes, clothes, furniture, groceries. And I wanted to take the holistic approach, because like I talked about before, when someone picks up and leave, if they leave, they have nothing. And so that puts a lot of additional anxiety on mom, because, okay, you left, but you don't have a bed, you don't have a TV, you don't have clothes, you don't have groceries, and you can't make it. So I wanted to have an organization where we could provide all of those things. So if somebody called me and says, Carol, I'm leaving today, I don't know where we're going, but, I was like, well, if you need money for a deposit for your new place, we got you. If you need transitional housing, we have 2 safe houses. I'm going to put you up here, and all of the services that we offer are at no charge to the people that we assist. And that is a number 1 priority for me. And we're probably the only nonprofit that don't have paid employees. Everybody's a volunteer, even me.
As I'm listening, I'm feeling very overwhelmed with the courage and the journey from where you were to say, my greatest accomplishment was first my children, violence-free home. That's breaking the cycle, and right there should just be, I commend you for that. But to take it to the next place in your life, to focus on the children, and to focus on that's compassion, right? If it was me, what would I want if I left that household? What would I need? A bed, a safe space, a hug, food. Besides your basics, you also, I think the basic premise is feeling safe for all children, right? So to create that, you should be commended, for the passion and the work that you put behind that. So I'm fascinated by it. So I asked the questions. If I guess we'll wrap it up by saying, if you had to summarize or give me for the people who come in my walk of life, but I can educate and help pass on your message. The three things that you would want my staff, agents, people to know about domestic violence itself, and whatever you feel you want to share with people.
First of all, domestic violence is a silent killer. And it's not just a tagline. It is real. It is the truth. And people need to understand that. And domestic violence is without boundaries. Race, religion, ethnicity, age, without boundaries, period. And it impacts everyone. And we think that because it's not physically apparent in front of us, it's impacting somebody that you know. Yeah. And even if you were out for dinner, during COVID times, and there was a domestic incident outside on the sidewalk, and someone was beaten really bad, or if someone was shot, it would impact you.
Yeah. And
so we must understand that this is a human problem. And we feel ashamed when we talk about domestic violence, but I take people back to the beginning of the Bible. The first homicide that ever existed in the human race was domestic. Two brothers, Cain and Abel. And we have to understand that we have not moved a lot further along when we think about domestic violence in our families, because we're really tight-lipped about it, as if we're ashamed about it. But we have to understand that it is real.
So it's a silent killer.
Yes.
And I feel as if, despite the years and years of speaking about it or addressing it or having these discussions, it's still prevalent. It still exists today. And the things that you brought today for me are what I leave here today is speaking to others around the country when I go around and talking to people, is that it is a silent killer, but for us also is what's used to facilitate these shootings, and that's
what creates the silence.
Right, exactly. So that's where I put my emphasis on. If I can take that firearm out of someone's hands that is potential for domestic violence, assault, or any of that, I feel like I'm at least trying to do my part. So I want to say thank you for educating me today, for just the work that you do, and you should be very proud. And I'm honored to sit in your company to have this conversation, because you went from such a tragic piece of your life, childhood history, and turn that into and choosing a path of public service to give and to make the world better. I have to say I commend you for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.